Okay, welcome. It's December, so it seems appropriate to go off to Bethlehem and share some of the terrain around Bethlehem, some of the geography and the history there. Probably 2 weeks worth. This week we hope to do the backstory of Bethlehem. There's so many layers of history there. As you stand there, you have to go back through the layers. So this week we do some of the early layers of the history of Bethlehem, and then next week hope to do the more recent layers when the angels appeared to the shepherds and said, "Fear not, I bring you good news of great joy." But there's a lot of history that happens before that, which is also very interesting. So that's where we are going to go this week. So let me pull up those slides for you, and we'll get started. Okay, Bethlehem is right about there. It is in what's called the rain shadow, as the warm, moisture-laden winds come up off the Mediterranean. The terrain rises to this great central ridge. As it rises, it cools, and since it cools, it drops the moisture. So you get fairly nice rainfall on the western ridge. And then once you cross over the ridge, the air can descend again, which warms it, and it doesn't rain anymore. So this is called a rain shadow. Everything that's past the ridge is called you're living in the rain shadow, which the Jordan Valley would be in the rain shadow. And then the fields of Moab over here, it rises again, so there's potential of a little bit more rainfall. If you've been in Washington State, you know what a rain shadow looks like. Western Washington State is quite well watered. Once you crest over the ridge, eastern Washington State is very dry and sunny, because all of eastern Washington is basically in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. So one more thing here. So Bethlehem is right about on that ridge or just past that ridge. So if you're having a good year with lots of rainfall, you're going to be in great shape in Bethlehem. But on a dry year, it's going to be difficult to make a living there. The other thing to notice about this is that these distances are not great. So if you're standing here at Bethlehem, you can literally look across the Jordan Valley. And if the fields of Moab happen to be very green this year, while your fields are quite dry, you can literally see it, which is, of course, the backstory of Elimelech and Naomi. Elimelech, during a very dry year, lifted up his eyes, looked across the valley, saw the green fields of Moab, and said to his wife Naomi, "Let's go." And as you remember, they went. And that didn't go so well. Okay, now let's get on to the next slide here. So there is Jerusalem, Bethlehem, about 5 miles south of Jerusalem, right on that ridge or just past it. We talked about that. Moab over here, and the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea was one long salt sea with a bit of a shallow part right there. Today that's not even true. Actually, this is dry land all the way across. It's two seas, which is an ecological problem, which we won't go into at the moment. But the point being that even when this was a continuous sea, this was very shallow water here. So if you were in Moab and you wanted to get to Bethlehem by the southern route, you would just go across the Lisan Peninsula, wade across a little ways of the water. This is why, incidentally, why Masada was built here, to guard that entrance to the Holy Land. You'd walk up a little bit to En Gedi, the spring of the wild goats, and then there's a spot to get up onto the high tableland and go into Bethlehem, which is what Naomi and Ruth did as they were returning from Moab. They came across here and up through En Gedi and then into Bethlehem. Okay, about 1,000 years later, the wise men who came from the east would have come into Jerusalem from the north. That's the normal way to come into Jerusalem. But when they left Jerusalem, recall, the angel said, don't go back to Herod, don't go through Jerusalem. So they would have had to come south out of Bethlehem, so as not to go back to Jerusalem, south out of Bethlehem. It would have gone down that same ascent of Ziz to En-Gedi, and then across the Dead Sea and back to Persia. So all the geography is still there, very much like it was in biblical times. So you might recall when I was talking about En-Gedi, this location of En-Gedi. The En, or Ein, is the word for spring, and Gedi is the wild goat. So this is the spring of the wild goats, or the fountain of the wild goats. And there indeed are the wild goats yet today. We'll pull you in a little bit closer with some of the little wild goats that still inhabit this area. And there is Papa Goat right there. And now let me read you a little bit from 1 Samuel, because you may not have noticed this before. In 1 Samuel, when David is fleeing from Saul, actually let me back up, they're more cute. Okay, David is fleeing from Saul, and it says David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi, the spring of the wild goats. That's this very area. And then Saul is returned, and he's told David is in the desert of En-Gedi. That would be the upper desert above this fountain. And then David and his men were near the crags of the wild goats. That's 1 Samuel 24. He came to the sheep pens along the way, and there was a cave there, which is still true today. Many caves along that valley. We'll get to those later. I'll get to the caves later. First, I want to complete this story. Also in that beautiful valley live those little characters, and they are mentioned in Psalm 104, that beautiful psalm of creation. In the cedars of Lebanon, the birds make their nests. The stork has its home in the junipers. The high mountains belong to the wild goats. We're just looking at them. In the next phrase, the crags in the rocks are a refuge for the hyrax, or sometimes translated coney, or rock badger. And here indeed they're still there. There's Mama Rock Badger and two of her little ones. So again, the geography doesn't change, and sometimes the wildlife doesn't change much either in those 3,000 years since the time of David. So as we go up this spring of En-Gedi, going farther and farther up the valley with this beautiful, refreshing water, we'll turn around for just a moment. That's the view back to the Dead Sea and toward Moab, and you just work your way up the valley of the wild goats, or the En-Gedi, and you come to a certain point, and there is what we know as the ascent of Ziz. It's a little trail that if you want to get up onto the tableland and eventually make it then to Bethlehem, you have to go up out of the valley at this point, and you'll know why in a few moments. But if you look carefully in your mind's eye and go back about 2,000 years, you can see an elderly woman working her way up that path with a younger woman, strangely dressed, but supporting her as they walk up that trail, returning to Naomi's ancient homeland and very new land for Ruth, her helper. If you squint your eyes and go forward from there 1,000 years, you can see three men on their camels coming down that ascent on their way back to Persia. Again, the geography doesn't change, and it's very interesting to walk in the footsteps of these people. Okay. You saw the mention in 1 Samuel about there were caves in that area, and so David and his men had hid in the cave, and Saul came into the cave. These are a little higher in the wall, of course, but nonetheless the idea that this type of rock is susceptible to caves, and so it would have been probably a little bit lower down, more accessible, although some of these were occupied in the Middle Ages by various monks who came in by ropes. I don't think David did that, but the geography is still there. As you come up to the head of the valley, now you know why the ascent of Ziz was necessary. If you walk the valley all the way to this point, you are not going to get up on top. You had to go up earlier, although it's very beautiful. And you're not encouraged to stand here in the waterfall and take a shower, but I have seen some high school students do it. So, okay, once you've gone up the ascent of Ziz, then it's just a few miles up on the tableland, brings you to Bethlehem. We are here just east of Bethlehem, on the shepherd's fields. And as Ruth and Naomi arrived here more than 1,000 years before the time of Christ, Ruth and Naomi would have found simple lodging, and Ruth went out to glean in the fields and wound up gleaning in the fields of a man named Boaz, who very kindly in due time put the corner of his garment over her. And this is where this would have taken place. And this is the threshing floor where Boaz and his team would have been threshing. And because it was a terrifically vulnerable time, when all the work has been done, all the harvesting has been done, some of the gathering has been done, it's terribly susceptible to thievery, and so the men would have actually slept at the threshing floor, partly to be close to their work, but also partly to keep thieves out. And this is an ancient threshing floor in use up until modern times, actually. So, okay, back to those fields for a moment. Ruth and Boaz were blessed with the birth of a son, Obed, and Obed had a son named Jesse, and Jesse had several sons, one of whom was King David. And David, as a shepherd boy, sat on these fields, just watching the flocks and thinking. And during those years, he composed some of that beautiful poetry, thinking about the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, Psalm 23. Or maybe at night, Psalm 8, when I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast set in place. What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou dost visit him? This is where some of that poetry was composed, maybe originally composed, written down later, or maybe even written down then. These, of course, are the very same fields that 1,000 years after David, the shepherd king, there were again shepherds in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night, when an angel appeared to them and said, fear not, for I bring you good news of great joy. And next week we hope to take you up to that point in the history of this very, very interesting place. So, okay, well, thanks for joining us, and hope you've learned a little bit about the backstory, the deep, deep backstory of God's gracious work in this area of Bethlehem, and we'll bring that forward next week. So again, thanks for joining us. Hope to see you again.